Audit Executive from the Office of the Auditor-General of South Africa. With me today is my colleague, Sipho Ndaba. He is also corporate audit executive. He's a corporate executive. I'm not audible. Shall I start again? Yes. All right. Good morning once again. My name is Mawatu Sedikela. I'm a corporate executive audit responsible for the Gauteng province. Accompanying me today is my colleague Sipho Ndaba. He is a corporate executive responsible for the specialized audit services unit, and that is where our performance audit unit is housed. Along with us is Kevesh Lachman. He is the business executive who is responsible for the business unit that does performance audit. And thank you for the opportunity to be at the joint inquiry today. And I want to advise the chairperson, we are all available as the executives to attend to the questions of clarity. Kevesh, being the business executive who conducted this audit, will be taking us through the presentation. But we will also, as the executives, avail ourselves for clarity-seeking questions. Also, Chair, for the record, we would like to advise that the Auditor-General has delegated to myself as the corporate executive, as well as Sipho, as well as Kevesh, to come and present to the inquiry. He supports it. As a fellow Chapter 9 institution, we remain committed to collaborating. He is unwell and as such has not been able to attend. Thank you, Chair. I will hand over to Kevesh to start the presentation.
Good morning, Chair. As Mawatu has indicated, my name is Kevesh Lachman. I'm the Business Executive for the Performance Audit Division within the Auditor-General South Africa. Good morning to the members. Thank you for this opportunity today, Chair, to do the presentation on the Urban Renewal Program with reference to Alexandra Renewal Project. We have distributed documents to the inquiry, and I refer you to those documents as I go through my briefing. So who are we and what do we do as the Auditor-General? The Auditor-General of South Africa is the supreme audit institution of our country. It is the only institution which by law must audit and report on how the government spends the South African taxpayer money. This has been a focus of the Auditor-General as an institution since inception in 1911. When the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa in 1996 came into effect, the AGSA was recognized as an independent constitutional institution supporting democracy, alongside fellow institutions such as the South African Human Rights Commission and the Public Protector. Our mission as a supreme audit institution is to strengthen our country's democracy by enabling oversight, accountability, and governance in the public sector, through auditing, thereby building public confidence. The AGSA annually produces audit reports on all government departments, public entities, municipalities, and certain public institutions. While these mandatory audits focus on the financial statements, financial management, compliance with relevant laws, and performance against predetermined objectives, the AGSA also performs a number of discretionary audits or tasks. One of these discretionary tasks is to conduct performance audits. Until the recent amendments to the Public Audit Act 2004, Act number 25 of 2004, is a PAA, performance audits have been conducted in terms of Section 188.4 of the Constitution, read with Sections 51D and 29 of the PAA. For purposes of this submission, the difference between the annual regulatory audits and performance audits must be clarified. Our regulatory audits are performed every year at the same time. They culminate in PFMA and MFMA general reports that pull together the results of all the regulatory audits performed per cycle. Regulatory audits focus on the strength of financial and performance management in all spheres of government. Performance audits, on the other hand, can be performed at any point in time. They independently evaluate the measures taken by the management of an organ of state to ensure that resources will be procured economically and used efficiently and effectively. These audits place special focus on citizens and taxpayers, as the primary questions asked during these assessments are whether government is doing the right thing and is doing it in the right and least expensive way. In essence then, the regulatory audit deal with those matters that form the foundation of proper service delivery, whereas performance audit deal with the resource management and specific strategically important service delivery areas. Our understanding of the inquiry. The AGSA understands that the inquiry is a joint response of the South African Human Rights Commission and the Public Protector to the threats of a total shutdown of Alexandra, received on 2nd April 2019. The South African Human Rights Commission sent representatives to Alexandra on 3 and 4 April 2019 to assess the situation and observed that the protest action was profoundly linked to the advancement of the community's struggle for the realization of their socio-economic rights. The aim of the inquiry is to investigate, raise findings, report on, and make recommendations concerning alleged violations to the rights contained in the Bill of Rights, improper conduct and maladministration as they relate to persons residing in Alexandra. Numerous organs of state had been called to share information with the inquiry. The scope of the investigation is clearly outlined in the inquiry's terms of reference. Our commitment. The AGSA studied the notice issued by the South African Human Rights Commission on 9 July 2019. It is our firm belief that the AGSA is constitutionally and morally bound to cooperate with the request outlined in this notice and hereby confirms its support to the inquiry. The participation of the representatives of our institution has been duly authorized by the Auditor-General in terms of Section 48 of the PAA. The AGSA's approach to participation. Our participation in the work of the inquiry is guided by the constitutional and statutory mandate of the AGSA, read with the 9 July 2019 notice and the terms of reference of the inquiry. Paragraph 4 of the notice requires all participants to make oral and written submissions to the inquiry panel in line with the parts of the terms of reference falling within the office's respective mandates. We have assessed the terms of reference and determined that the inquiry may be interested to engage the AGSA on matters that specifically fall within the ambit of paragraph 4.2.5, namely whether the alleged 1.3 billion rand budget allocated for the Alexandra Renewal Program was utilized for the purpose which it was intended, and if not, whether such resulted into the prejudice of the community of Alexandra. The basis for the remainder of the submission is our 2016 Performance Audit Report titled Performance Audit of the Effectiveness of the Urban Renewal Program at the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. Background to the performance audit. The origination of the performance audit on the Urban Renewal Program. The performance audit on the Urban Renewal Program at the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements came about when residents of Bekkersdal in the Western Area Municipality raised concerns during service delivery protests. Among their concerns were issues with poor progress on the Bekkersdal Urban Renewal Project. The Greater Western Area Concerned Residents Association indicated that the Bekkersdal Urban Renewal Project was underperforming in comparison to the other urban renewal projects, namely those of Alexandra, Wintersveld, and Everton. Another concern was that a large portion of the funding had been spent with little tangible results. The members of the Executive Council for the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements and the Gauteng Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs then requested the AGSA in July 2014 to conduct an audit that would assess the performance of the 4 urban renewal projects. Alexandra Renewal Project in the context of overall audit. For purposes of this joint inquiry by the South African Human Rights Commission and Public Protector, it is important to understand the context of the performance audit of the Urban Renewal Program in relation to the Alexandra Renewal Project. The focus of the performance audit, as agreed with the MECs, was to report on the Urban Renewal Program of the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements and not on individual urban renewal projects. Consequently, the audit was not limited to the ARP, but the ARP was evaluated in relation to the Bekkersdal, Wintersveld, and Everton projects. This said, the audit reported cross-cutting findings that were common under all 4 projects, including transversal issues under major findings relating to the 4 URP projects. Our conclusion in the report, therefore, focused on the URP as a whole, highlighting only the significant concerns in each urban renewal project. Similarly, our key recommendations, as reported, focused on the improvements of the 4 urban renewal projects with the intention of influencing the provincial leadership to implement better controls across the program. Our findings for the purpose of this inquiry will be extracted specifically for the ARP, limited to the questions that the audit sought to respond to. Best practices from the URP were also compiled, and we recommended that they be applied consistently across the URP and for the duration of the program. Objectives and coverage of the performance audit. The objective of the performance audit was to determine whether the renewal projects remain focused on the areas prioritized at the initiation. We focused on assessing whether the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements had implemented the renewal projects according to the initial objectives. We intended to observe the way in which the 4 renewal projects implemented electricity, water and sanitation, roads and stormwater, and housing and building activities. We examined examples of these activities in each of the 4 projects and concluded on the common issues found in each activity. In assessing the implementation of the above-mentioned project areas, the following overall outcomes were sought. How the Beckersdale, Alexandra, Wintersveld and Everton projects had performed. Whether the projects were implemented according to the initial scope of work. Whether the scope of the Alexandra, Wintersveld and Everton renewal projects was the same as that of Beckersdale renewal project. Below are the focus areas we evaluated in order to achieve the outcomes presented above. Under planning, the researchable questions we asked: is the planning for the urban renewal program adequate? Under implementation, are the urban renewal projects being implemented according to the initial scope of the works? Access to basic infrastructure. Has the urban renewal program succeeded in ensuring that communities have sustainable access to basic infrastructure, such as bulk, water and sanitation services, as well as housing and social amenities? Supply chain. Where the proper supply chain processes followed. Project budget and expenditure. The Alexandra renewal project budget was initially estimated at 1.3 billion, intended to be over a 7-year period from 2001 to 2007. The project was then extended to 2010 and extended again indefinitely. According to the report to the City of Joburg Mayoral Committee, total expenditure for the Alexandra project as at 2012-13 was 2.2 billion rand, as per the table below. The City of Joburg and the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements funded 83% of the ARP. The balance was funded by the Human Settlements Fund, Municipal Infrastructure Grant, the Gauteng Department of Transport, and the Gauteng Department of Economic Development. The government institutions that have provided funds for the Alexandra renewal project: the institution, Gauteng Department of Human Settlements, and the expenditure for 2012 to 2012-13 financial years was 1.381 billion rand. City of Joburg was 444 million. Human Settlements Fund between 2001 to 2005 was 88 million. The Municipal Infrastructure Grant, CIMA, was 173 million. Gauteng Department of Transport was 109 million. Gauteng Department of Economic Development was 15 million. And the total expenditure came to 2.21 billion. Scope limitations. Due to the limitation of scope, the auditors could not answer all the researchable questions conclusively for the ARP. The limitation of scope is clearly stated in the foreword of the public report and the major findings. This is further clearly stated in findings and the conclusions within the ARP section of the report. Our audit procedures were limited to electrification and some building projects. We did not have sufficient information to audit water and sanitation, roads and stormwater projects, and the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. Due to the lack of documents for auditing, we could not conclude on all the questions as set out. And this is very important because it refers to the scope limitation. Findings. The findings below relate to the ARP audit and seek to answer the researchable questions in paragraph 3 above. Planning. The original and approved business plans could not be provided by the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. The auditors relied on individual business plans and other documents that were made available to the project teams. There was poor project planning and a lack of documentation to assess the planning of the project. In addition, the individual projects within the ARP were not effectively implemented and monitored. The funding for the ARP was initially ring-fenced and separated from the regional budgets, that is, provincial and COJ budgets. However, as from the 13-14 financial year, this budget also became part of the regional budget, that is, no longer ring-fenced. The required budget was estimated at 1.3 billion rand at the inception of the project in 2001. Due to the lack of documentation, we could not confirm that the 1.3 billion nor the 2.2 billion expenditure was exclusively used for this project. Implementation. Due to funding constraints, the ARP Central Urban Renewal Project Office was disbanded in 2011. This left the regional heads who took over the responsibility of the ARP with limited resources. Without a central budget, the ARP had to source funding from the respective municipalities. As a result, some planned project activities were not implemented. The ARP had no project implementation system, and vital project documentation could not be produced for audit. This included contracts, progress reports, and variation orders. Without these documents, we are unable to audit the water and sanitation, roads and stormwater projects. Also, this made it difficult to assess the costs of projects. Access to basic infrastructure. Without appropriated documentation, as mentioned above, the only areas the audit could comment on were electrification and some housing projects. With regards to the electrification project, concerns were raised about the congestion in urban areas. These conditions led to instances of up to 12 electrical connections in one source and pose a risk of instability in the electrical supply, electrocution, high maintenance costs, and challenges to the overall sustainability of the infrastructure. With regard to the housing projects, not all project-related information was provided. This made it difficult for the audit team to evaluate the work and determine whether it was effectively managed or not. During the visits to the project, we noted quality issues. However, we were unable to determine whether this resulted from poor workmanship and failure to adhere to specifications, or from a lack of maintenance after the buildings were handed over to the municipalities and beneficiaries. Supply chain. Without the appropriate supporting documentation, we were unable to audit procurement within the ARP. As such, we could not conclude on supply chain management. Whether the scope of Alexandra, Wintersveld, and Everton renewal projects was the same as that of the Beckersdale renewal project. As part of the audit, we established that urban renewal projects had different objectives that addressed the needs of their respective communities, which led to the outcomes being different. All four urban renewal projects experienced similar problems in delivering on the promises outlined in the individual business plans. These cross-cutting findings included poor project management, poor planning, poor departmental support, and poor departmental
to the needs of their communities. This will help the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements to refocus and achieve the objective of upgrading. Improve the way in which the ARP is monitored. There should be a clear process that ensures that implementation of the ARP is centrally monitored. Ensure that the ARP delivers and follows a communication strategy for its community so that the community is updated on the progress made with the project and can provide feedback to management. Develop a uniform internal communication strategy for the program, which will ensure effective communication between the regional and provincial offices. Challenges within the ARP should be clearly and promptly communicated to management to ensure an improved response. Establish a proper documentation and filing system to track information and monitor projects. This will ensure that all project information is available on the project files. Ensure that those entrusted with the responsibility of planning, monitoring, and reporting on the ARP are provided with the necessary capacity, resources, and support to carry out the tasks effectively. Develop a uniform approach to reporting on progress made with the ARP program. Progress reports should contain sufficient information to enable management to make informed and timely decisions. Such information should be readily available to all relevant stakeholders, including members of the community. Develop a funding mechanism that will address the complex requirements of the program. Coordinate the planning and budgets for the program with other stakeholders to ensure that the roles and responsibilities are clear and projects are adequately funded. Reevaluate the institutional arrangements of the program. The current structures lack the authority to ensure commitment from all stakeholders and shared accountability for the success of the program. Formalize the commitments of and agreements with other stakeholders to ensure the success of the program. Commitments received from the external stakeholders. Before tabling the report in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature during November 2016, extensive stakeholder engagements were conducted with the following persons: Premier of Gauteng, the chairs for Corporate Governance, Traditional Affairs and Human Settlements, the Speaker, Gauteng Provincial Legislature, MEC, Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs and Human Settlements, the heads of Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs, heads of Department of Human Settlements, the Mayor and Municipal Managers, City of Shwane, Mayor and Municipal Manager of Mfuleni, Mayor and Municipal Manager of Western Area Local Municipality, Mayor and Municipal Manager of City of Joburg. The leadership welcomed the insights offered by the Auditor-General South Africa in their response and made the following commitments. The coordinating departments have acknowledged the shortcomings in the rollout of the Urban Renewal Program and undertook to address the shortcomings that were identified. The lack of human resources in the coordinating departments to effectively plan, execute and coordinate the Urban Renewal Program is receiving attention, and the newly appointed Chief Director at the Gauteng Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs will assume responsibility for the program. The replacement of scarce skills and enhancement of information systems in the department will be prioritized, while the appointment of an engineering consultant is being considered to manage the technical aspects of the program. The process of refocusing the URP will start with the adoption of a resolution by the executive committees of the coordinating departments, after which a detailed plan will be prepared for each program. The resolution will entail a recommendation that funds be ring-fenced for the Urban Renewal Program and that coordinating departments align their plans to ensure delivery. The Gauteng Department of Human Settlements will lead the process and recommend a new structure for the URP. Commitments solicited and followed up through engagements. These commitments, as stipulated in paragraph 9, have been followed up with the relevant leadership in COJ and Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. Subsequent work done through the audit of COJ and Gauteng Department of Human Settlements did not reveal any significant improvements to the findings of the performance audit. The responses on the commitments, however, were not fully verified through the regularity audit. The Standing Committee of Public Accounts, SCOPA, in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature followed up with the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements in September 2017. commitment. The coordinating departments have acknowledged the shortcomings in the rollout of the URP and undertook to address the shortcomings that were identified. The progress, Gauteng Department of Human Settlements, with September 2017, based on the presentation shared with SCOPA in 2017, the departments provided details of the status of each of these findings raised. The progress of the AGSA's review as at 2018-19, shortcomings identified are still in progress. The lack of human resources in the coordinating departments to effectively plan, execute and coordinate the urban renewal program is receiving attention, and the newly appointed Chief Director of the Gauteng Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs will assume responsibility for the program. The replacement of scarce skills and enhancement of information systems in the department will be prioritized, while the appointment of an engineering consultant has been considered to manage technical aspects of the program. The procurement of additional capacity is currently being finalized, and the progress from the AGSA that this is partially implemented, the below could be determined. A Chief Director was appointed to oversee the entire urban renewal program at the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. A proper documentation and filing system was developed, but not fully implemented. The process of refocusing the URP will start with the adoption of a resolution by the Executive Committee of the coordinating departments, after which a detailed plan will be prepared for each program. The resolution will entail a recommendation that funds be ring-fenced for the URP and that coordinating departments align the plans to ensure delivery. The Gauteng Department of Human Settlements will lead the process and recommended a new structure for the urban renewal program. The response, as documented under the Progress Gauteng Department of Human Settlements, engagements with the Executive Committee were initiated to seek approval for a plan for better province-wide coordination of the program. Comprehensive master plans for 5 to 7 years were formulated for all towns but remained unbudgeted for and therefore could not be implemented. The MEC has resuscitated engagements with the Alexandra landowners in preparation for the implementation of the Statement of Intent and hosting the Land Summit. Work to establish steering committees and community structures in each of the towns is continuing. Efforts to raise budget for the program included engaging the Technical Provincial Infrastructure Coordinating Committee and several engagements with the Provincial Treasury. These were not successful. And then the progress for the AGSA as at 18-19. Since the URP audit, there has been no significant refocus on the program. Based on the audits performed and our insights and observations of the past 3 years, funds have not been ring-fenced. The area surrounding Alexandra has not been prioritized in terms of budget allocation and funding. No significant housing projects have been planned by Gauteng Department of Human Settlements and COJ within the Alexandra area. Our insights into the current 18-19 audit year confirm the same for both COJ and the Gauteng Department of Human Settlements. The total average capex budget per year at COJ is 7 billion rand. Therefore, the average total value of the Alexandra project planned per year only contributed on average 2% to the total capex projects. Conclusion. The achievement of the priorities the government has outlined in its National Development Plan requires that departments, municipalities and entities make the best possible use of the current model for planning, budgeting and monitoring in government, and institute a foundation of strong controls that are executed with discipline and at a level of excellence. Attending to the recommendations relating to the ARP will assist in moving Gauteng government to such a situation, where Alexandra citizens can tangibly experience these basic elements of quality living in South Africa, as envisaged in the Constitution. We thank the inquiry for the opportunity to present the AGSA insights into the ARP. We pledge our continued support and appreciation to the work of the Commission and Public Protector, and wish the Commission and Public Protector success in its objectives. I thank you.
Thank you for the. Would you like to take anything before we ask questions?
I was just going to say thank you. That concludes the presentation, and we're ready to take questions, Chair.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very comprehensive indeed, and will assist this process. The inquiry panel will now engage with your submission, and I'll now allow my colleague on my far right to ask her questions. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. This is an inquisitorial process, so we're just going to ask questions of a clarificatory nature. Okay, thank you very much. So, as a fellow Chapter 9 institution, you've indicated that the performance audit was prompted by service delivery protests in the area, and we are largely in the same position as you were. What prompted this inquiry? So, I was wondering whether the Auditor-General had any insights from the work that you've done and the performance audit that you've conducted on how do we as the Chapter 9s get ahead of the curve on these issues so that we don't only become aware of them when communities have reached a crisis point in what they regard as the service delivery in their areas. Thank you. You can go ahead and answer.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the best way that we could gear up, we audit annually as mentioned, and we issue our reports to those charged with governance, having discussed them with management. We submit them to the respective legislatures, and we issue our general reports, both the PFMA and MFMA. And in those reports, we try and simplify the matters at hand and give a sense of the foundational matters that are not being attended to and where there are challenges. And that report, I think we've just shared the MFMA one, Auditor General shared it most recently, and that's giving a picture about local government that says a lot needs to be done. And we continue to engage on our side with those charged with governance and follow up the recommendations. I think what we could do more in terms of collaborating as fellow Chapter 9 institutions is to create platforms to see how the audits that we have shared, the general reports insights, the lack of action sometimes on implementing the recommendations, and elevate those and see how we can collaborate in teasing out what needs to be done collaboratively between ourselves. Because on the audit side, as I mentioned, we continue to engage even after the audit process. We continue to follow up even through processes called status of records, where we audit a couple of months afterwards, we go back to try and ascertain what progress is being made. So I think we can continue to report, but we need to collaborate more on sharing insights on areas that are vulnerable, areas that we could, that you may be working on, that we may not be aware, and see how our work can provide insights into those areas.
Thank you very much. If you have anything else to add, you may. No? Thank you. So just as a clarification, I think that the report says that the audit was still ongoing. Does that mean in 2016 when this was released? Sorry, not the audit, the Alexandra Renewal project was still ongoing. Does that mean in 2016 it was still ongoing?
That's correct.
The report and your presentation allude to the lack of availability of documents, and even in the case of the Alexandra Renewal project, even the most basic of documents, including the initial business plan, itself was not available to the Auditor-General when they conducted the audit. Is this something that you would see regularly occurring in the course of performance audits? Is this a normal thing to occur? It seems like a very basic document that one would need not only to perform your job as the Auditor General, but for the plan to actually be implemented itself within the relevant departments.
Thank you. We have encountered lack of documentation as a major audit shortcoming in various audits, not only in performance audit, but cross-cutting in the other audit disciplines also. So lack of documentation, lack of supporting documentation is a concern.
I can add to that, because I think in performance audit as well as in the general audit environment, in the general report we often analyze the root causes for the lack of attendance to the recommendations we raise. One of the areas we continue to report on is poor records management. We find that even in the audit process, sometimes the information is not easily retrievable, is not well stored and archived, and also easily retrievable in the event of a disaster. So records management and record keeping is an area that government-wide, both in regulatory audit and in performance audit, that can receive attention.
Perhaps just to add, I think from a regulatory audit, it's a lot to keep financial records. But from a performance audit, when it relates to projects, it's not necessarily a loss, so you find that the disciplines are much looser when it comes to projects versus the normal financial management.
Thank you very much. So you've also indicated that the budgets were initially ring-fenced at some point, and then I think that you said that in 2013-14 that ring-fencing ceased to happen, and the budgets were either unring-fenced or the ring-fencing just didn't occur. Is this something that you see regularly when you perform performance audits of this nature? Is it something that we should regard as strange or as a red flag? If you could just give us some insights into how common that is. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, with regard to the budgets being ring-fenced, we have to go back. The ARP was originally a presidential project, and as such it was treated. The other three, which we are looking at in totality as the URP. The other three were not presidential projects. So the initial part of this project, the budgets were ring-fenced, and it was treated as such. At the latter stage, when the project had moved to be fully part of the URP in the 13-14 financial year, that is when the ring-fencing then was taken away. So to answer the question as to other projects, we do see in some projects where they will ring-fence funds for specific activities, but it's not necessarily a common. It depends from project to project on the nature of the project and the source of the project. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, I'd like to add that I think the intention of ring fencing is a commendable one, because there are many conflicting priorities that government has to attend to. And once it is ring fenced, I think it augurs well for the ability to keep that money for the intended projects. And I think then ceasing to ring fence it puts the projects at a risk of continuing to compete with other conflicting priorities, and as a result, projects may not get implemented as envisaged.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So in terms of the progress on commitment that you referred to just at the end of your presentation, and thank you, these are very helpful to us. You pointed out that progress as at 2018-19, that there were no significant housing projects planned by the Gauteng Department of Housing Settlements or the City of Joburg in Alex. This seems to just appear to be inconsistent with the original purpose for which the Alexandra Renewal Project was conceived, and the shortcomings that were identified that the project was conceptualized to address. Is that something that you found strange when you attributed when you did the assessment of the progress? And perhaps I'm not asking a fair question because you're being asked to give a subjective determination, but it's something that I read and find to be surprising, given the original project as conceived. Did you have a similar response as the Auditor-General?
Thank you, Chair. So for the matter pertaining to the City of Johannesburg and the 2018-19, we will rather come back to you with the exact quantum of the details. This table here was just to illustrate how following up on the commitments, and the audit is still going to be underway for the current financial year. And ordinarily, the performance audit, we would do a follow-up audit in about 4 or 5 years. But we haven't done one as yet, having tabled this in November 2016. So on a audit basis, then when we do our regulatory audit, we attempt to follow up what progress has been made, but it hasn't been to the detail of auditing it and concluding. But we did not want to leave the panel without insights of how the verbal presentation made in 2017 and what is our high-level assessment of the of COJ. We're happy to bring back figures to the tune of how much is budgeted in the City of Johannesburg, because if I may, the Department of Human Settlements will transfer funds to the City of Johannesburg through Human Settlements Grant, and then we will subject that to audit. The audit is underway currently at Human Settlements to be finalized, and then for City of Johannesburg it will be in November. So we're happy to bring the finalized audit outcomes once it has been made available as a public document, but we can bring the ones of the previous year to give you the exact quantum of how the project is organized, because the URP would be sitting in the Human Settlements Annual Performance Plan. Similarly, it would be sitting in the City of Johannesburg's plans, and we would, through regulatory audit, sample and select. So we may or may not have audited, and we're happy to bring that information if that is appropriate.
Thank you very much. I appreciate. So in terms of the major findings in your report, which is sort of a list of more general findings across all the projects that you did the performance audit on across the urban renewal project, and I know that you've also noted some of the strengths, and the ARP does have some separate strengths of its own. But you may be aware that something that we've repeatedly raised, because we've seen it coming up again and again, is also something that you've alluded to here in your major findings, which is a lack of cooperation from the relevant sector departments. That seems to be something that we've been hearing in our submissions constantly, where departments have indicated that they felt that they've been unable to deliver on certain mandates because other departments haven't provided necessary for example, infrastructure. If it's housing, then they said that the bulk infrastructure hasn't been available. But we've had the same problem reiterated in a number of different areas. Is there any way that you can give us a little bit more, maybe context or background to that finding in this context? Or whether, as a general proposition, it's something that you see as the Auditor-General coming up repeatedly? Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, this was something that we had observed in the audit process, that there was this lack of cooperation between the key role players that were to deliver on this project. And I think it's important also to go back to our recommendations on this, because our recommendations, if you look at it, is something that we stress there, that intergovernmental cooperation needs to improve. Okay, so it was not just for ARP, but it was overall for the URP process. And we picked up instances in the audit where we could not get documentation, we could not get agreements and these type of things, and we said these things need to be tied down. There has to be better cooperation for service delivery to happen. Thank you.
So again, just to push you a little bit more, because we are also trying to conceptualize what this cooperation should look like. It's something that's coming up very strongly across the entire inquiry. We also have been emphasizing it not only in this inquiry, but through our reports that we've been issuing as a commission as well, is that there's an urgent need for departments to cooperate to deliver basic services largely, but lots of other things as well. And when we have questioned departments on it, a lot of what we hear coming back is that, okay, we've established these meetings, they're going to be meetings between different spheres, they're going to be meetings at different levels, and it's very difficult for us to assess, I think, from the side of the table, whether that's going to be an adequate conceptualization of cooperation. So just from your experience as Auditor-General, whether you've seen any instances of cooperation or what we term cooperative governance, intergovernmental coordination, have you seen any examples that can maybe guide us to what we should recommend going forward for the purposes of Alexandra? Thank you.
Chair, once again, I think just to give the good practices that you refer to, there should be proper SLAs in place, service level agreements between the departments, which are clearly outlines the expectations, responsibilities, roles of the different key players. There should be project teams with the various skills from the various disciplines that reside in different departments or entities. And these skills can be engineering skills, it can be communication skills, because the team needs to be put together with a lot of different skills to deliver on these services. So you'll see that the coordination between some of the departments and some of the municipalities, etc., there's different skills that reside within these different environments. And when we're putting these teams together and these cooperation together, you need to draw on those skills so that it understands the needs of the project and it addresses the needs of the project. Also, the budget commitments and agreements on these budgets. When the budgets are put together, there should be concrete commitments and agreement to the funds that is going to be utilized for these, and these commitments kept continuously through the duration of these projects. Also, a critical thing is having the proper systems in place. Remember, we alluded to your record keeping and having proper record keeping. Also, having proper systems that facilitate proper record keeping. And again, having the process in place that allows for skills transfers, continuation of skills. So when we talk about this intergovernmental cooperation, we're talking about a combination of all these coming together, so that when we engage to start implementing a project, we have the necessary resources for the project, we have the necessary plans in place for the project, we have the necessary skills in place for the project, we have proper reporting processes in place for the project. And these not necessarily will come from one source. And that's why we're saying it's so important for the intergovernment, because these different skills will reside in different environments that you find in government. I hope that gives a bit more clarity. Thank you.
Perhaps I can also add, I think the biggest challenge is the project governance, because that's the vehicle that you use to define the different roles and responsibilities, as well as the mandates, which makes it easier from an auditing perspective than to make sure that we hold those who are charged with those mandates accountable for the activities that they perform. So without those proper or formalizing of those mandates as well as the roles and responsibilities, it becomes difficult to enforce accountability.
If I may add, Chair, you asked for an example. Unfortunately, the Alexandra Renewal Program, characterized with the shortcomings it has, doesn't serve as a good example. However, in its design and formulation, it had all the critical elements of what would have been a well-run and an effective IGR. They had, as I draw attention to page 11 of our submission, and it's in the report on page 21, we've lifted those 5 that we picked up from their planning documents, because they had clearly defined the roles and responsibilities. They had intended to ring fence, and I mentioned earlier that the intention behind the ring fencing was great because of the conflicting priorities you'll see once government's scarce resources need to be made available. They also had, okay, thank you. So I'm just going to repeat the 5. It was an effective co-funding, clear stakeholder agreements, viable funding models, streamlining of deliverables, and availability of a dedicated team. So in principle, those are very good ways of implementing a project of this magnitude.
unfortunately, the implementation did not follow what was designed.
Thank you. I think that insight is very helpful to us, especially because we sort of see, I think your report definitely gives us a little bit of a theme as the time goes on, the management of the project starts, getting worse and worse and worse, and sort of the accountability measures start, things are transferred, things are moved around, different departments are involved, different people are employed, vacancies arise that are not filled, and we start to see the deterioration of the delivery of the services as initially conceived. And we've heard recent submissions about conceiving that, the new sort of, I would hesitate to call it a project, but delivery of services, this is going to be something that takes another 10 to 20 years. And when you see a timeline and conceive a timeline like that, and we obviously wish to avoid the issues that arose initially, it's really insightful for us to get a good idea of how we can avoid those things and what worked and what didn't work. So I think that's really helpful to us. I also see that you've also emphasized public participation, and that keeping in touch with the community and keeping abreast of the community needs as they evolve, because obviously Alexandra and the different areas of Alexandra, it's not a stagnant community, it's evolving all the time, changing all the time, and the state needs to be responsive to that. So perhaps if you could just give us a little bit of insight into and your recommendation. I think there was one that specifically targeted community involvement and communication, and then also maybe just as a general proposition, your experience as the AG of what role that plays and how it maybe helps with accountability and service delivery. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, what we observed is, and I'll talk about URP as a start, there needs to be constant, on any project, there needs to be constant feedback to the expectations of communities. Yeah. Within the time frame of the project, you need to give constant feedback. But also you need to have, and as I mentioned earlier, as part of the good governance, you need to have a proper system of doing this. You need to have proper information. The information needs to be in the form that it can be communicated and understood. During this review, we could not get information that could show that this was continuously and effectively happening. And remember, I'm saying again, we could not get information. We could not see these documents, or we could not find correspondence that relate to these things. And it was a concern to us, because obviously if you're not keeping the community informed of what is happening, then it creates, a community will create its own perception as to what is happening. So I think it's important that, going back to your control environment, that these processes are put in place up front. You identify a project, you need to identify, and as we put in our recommendations, and put concrete, tangible mechanisms in place to facilitate this process. It cannot happen on an ad hoc basis. It has to be properly planned, it has to be properly coordinated, you have to have the right skills in place to ensure that the right messages and the right information to support those messages. So I think it's something that we also promote as a AGSA in all our audits, that this communication, and as an organization we do it through various means. If we look at our reports, look at our general report, we're continuously trying to improve this process of communication, because it leads to better understanding by communities and citizens. Thank you.
Just to add, through you, Chair, I think the importance of, as the members mentioned, of the engaging the public, the government has got the requisite policies and guidance on it. If you look at the local government, even the initiation of the IDP process commences with getting a wish list, shall I say, from the citizens. There's so many expectations that we have, and there's limited funds available to get everything. So it's important that if projects are going to be delivered that respond to the needs of the services of the community, that initial engagement takes place. And then obviously they would need to go back and look at what is available in terms of funding, what is doable in terms of that wish list, and what is not doable, because they must prioritize. They cannot provide everything. And then to go back to that very community and close that gap on what is going to be done and what is not going to be done. I think that will help in reducing an expectation gap. It will help in reducing a sense that government, when they plan, they communicate when they're planning, and on the delivery side, they're not able to do everything. And obviously the importance of the disciplines, I think, as Sipho, my colleague, referred to earlier, about the importance of a discipline around how projects are managed, of record keeping. So planning, monitoring, in your monitoring and evaluation remains equally important. And to go back to those very communities and account on how things have been done, what is running behind, and what the progress are, because the communities are in there, they're living in those environments and they're experiencing those frustrations. So communicating if there's project delays, I think will assist with many frustrations that we have seen that were evident in the project. And I think as Kivesh has mentioned, that it was a cross-cutting finding across all the projects. That absence of the communication, even within that communication, is both internal, as our recommendation, as well as external facing. So it could really be strengthened to help reduce the anxiety and the tensions that arise later, result in the service delivery protest.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that question brings me full circle to the initial question that I asked you about how we arrive in this place where we have to conduct inquiries of this nature. That's all my questions for now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your presentation. I must admit it's quite depressing to hear the challenges that were faced and the fact that after 20 odd years of democracy we're still basically in our nascent phase. But my first question relates to the management of the project. You mentioned in your report that the Johannesburg Development Agency was tasked with running the project because of their expertise in the AMIX management system. Could you please just explain what that is, what the AMIX management system is, how it works, and also exactly what the JDA's role was in this?
Thank you. Chair, as mentioned further in the report, there were shortcomings as to the project management, especially with documentation of the project and management of the project in that space. So when this was identified, the city had indicated that the project will move to the JDA, the Development Agency, Joburg Development Agency. And the system that was going to be utilized for this was the APEX system, which was going to be the management system for the project. When we talk about the management system for the project, we're referring to the various management principles. The system will be your project management system, because that was lacking initially when the project was residing previously in its previous environment. So that is the reference to it. The details of that system, we wouldn't have went into much detail. It was the movement of that. We were more interested in the movement of the system.
Thank you for that. The question I'm going to ask next is linked to what my colleague stated relating to intergovernmental relations. What I wanted to find out was, judging from your findings, it appears as though this was a project which was like, where people are testing the waters to see if things are possible for the different spheres of government to work together. And I just wanted to find out from your experience, was this the first project of this kind? These urban renewal projects, were they the first of their kind where all these spheres of government had to work together, had funding coming from different streams which had to be managed in order to deliver services to communities? Because I still don't understand how there was difficulties with cooperating between the different spheres when they've got this ambitious project going.
Okay. Again, Chair, thanks for the question. Whether this was the first kind nature would be very difficult for me to answer offhand. Okay, we're talking about South Africa as a whole. I am aware of a lot of projects, either on provincial level or within national boundaries, where there's a lot of different departments and different entities that will collaborate to provide different expertise and services. Well, if we look at the RDP project previously, the infrastructure will be put in at times by municipalities, the housing structures will be put in either by national human settlements or provincial human settlements, and these date back to projects. So there has been this, you can see, there is this cooperation levels. I believe the presidential project in terms of ARP and the URP as a broader project, there was again drawing on those principles of cooperation. Because of the nature of the project, there has to be different services that are put in, whether it is bulk infrastructure and then the top structures, etc. So there has to be coordination from various different governmental departments and entities for that to happen. What we found is that this was lacking. The effectiveness of this was lacking, and I think that was the focus. So the structures, I think, do have resided in government, but in this specific instance, the effectiveness of the cooperation of them and the coordination of them was lacking, and that's what we highlight in the report.
Perhaps just as a follow-up, did you get a sense for why that was? Like, what could the underlying reasons for that lack of cooperation be, other than obviously the lack of systems being in place, but was there anything else that you picked up?
Yeah, I think it was already mentioned in terms of making sure that the projects are adequately resourced, because one of the major issues that came out of the report was having the right skills to drive certain activities in the project. And again, it goes back to how you plan for the project in terms of the overall business plan, and making sure you have clear in terms of what the deliverables are, and you have the right resources, including systems. So system is not the only resource, but it's one of the resources that you need to deliver successfully.
If I may add to Sipo what he just said, and I think this is important, and we've seen it on some of the projects also. Remember, we spoke about roles and responsibilities in this clear dedication. Also, you must remember, when there's a project that comes about where you've got different entities putting skills together, you need to also ensure that you allow those skills that you're putting together the time and energy to be able to focus on that project. Because what happens is it becomes, and I say this in a manner where it becomes sort of the second cousin, if I may. So you have to make sure that there's priority to the project, there's priority to those commitments and those responses. And that's why we go back to what we mentioned earlier about the SLAs need to be very clear in terms of reference of what you need, the real skills that you need. You cannot be just the second initiative that needs to happen.
I was just going to add, Chair, that the way of doing business through the IGR is one that is going to remain for government, because the way they've been set up across the three spheres, so the strengthening of the IGR is going to be important. And so, not directly answering your question whether it's the first project, but I imagine that it still remains a way of focus for all the other projects and how government intends to run its business.
My last question relates to the delivery of housing projects in the ARP. We had the MEC for Human Settlements before us a couple of days ago, and when he was asked about what mechanisms the department had in place to actually ensure that when a project was handed over to the community, i.e. a housing complex was handed over, it met the specifications of what was initially planned in the budget plan, he told us that government has a standard that they adhere to, and he's sure if they were handed over, then that standard was met. And when we put it to him that we received complaints from members of the community that the houses were not of good quality, there were issues with beneficiaries not being allocated housing despite them registering and some even paying deposits, he said then those people need to complain to government. So what I wanted to find out from you was, in your opinion, for a project like this, which is such a huge investment of taxpayers' money, how do you make sure you get your value back? How do you make sure that you make good on that investment by firstly maintaining it and ensuring that when you do hand it over, you've got something in place to ensure that there won't be any corruption, or the quality of work that's produced is what you actually paid for?
Sure, thank you. That's a very interesting question, and I think it's a very important question. I think it's one of those questions that South Africa is trying to find answers to. But I think it starts with, if you look at our recommendations very closely, it starts setting that space of saying these are the basic things you need to have in place. Right? Because yes, we've got all these handover certificates, and we've looked at, when we look at projects, we look at the handover certificates, and we look at that these are properly ticked, etc., that, quality issues, etc., in place. But I think it is important that the process is not what happens at the end. It's what you start at the beginning. So, and if you look at our report, and you look at the recommendations we are making, those things need to be in place to ensure that the end product is of the quality and of the requirement that you have, and what's the expectations of the community. So it starts with getting those principles and those basics right as we've set them out up front.
Through you, Chair, I think you'll see in the report we've referred to the section of the report which deals with housing. We've referred to the limitations we observed when we went to look at the number of the houses. Given that the project was initiated in 2001 and we were conducting it in 14-15, when we selected houses to try and do exactly that which you're asking, to say that government get value for money. And we do that through having selected houses and gone onto site and looked at the state and the condition of those houses. Our limitation came in that when we went back to engage with the department about the deteriorating condition, we've raised findings in there, and we've referred to them as quality management. And we've observed a number of deficiencies in the condition of the houses. We've seen leaking roofs, cracks, and so forth. And the response, the department, was unable to ascertain whether the deterioration was caused perhaps through lack of maintenance, or whether when the houses were handed over initially, they were in the right condition. So it would also be very difficult for us to comment on whether at the stage of handing over the houses, were they in the right condition to make sure that the value for money was derived for government, which is the responsibility of the department to do. So would be constrained to assist with that. But it's an important principle that ought to be in place, that if projects are going to be delivered, before they're handed over, that process, they need to inspect, satisfy themselves. We ordinarily do that in our performance audit. We would have checked that that is in place. We would look at the beneficiary list to see whether the people who are on the list are the ones who got the houses and so forth. But the scope limitation really hampered the effectiveness of us being able to make that conclusion. And so then we left with the issue of the quality as we saw it, or at that stage, is not really inspiring.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions today.
Good morning to the AG team. We thank you for honoring our invite. I note that the dominant theme of your presentation is basically to say that you could not conclude on all the researchable questions due to the lack of documents. that related to the Alexandra Renewal Project. Now, that being the case, I just want you to first assist the panel by understanding whether or not is it not a statutory requirement for accounting officers of the departments, be it at national or provincial level, to ensure a proper management and keeping of all financial records of the department, and to submit such to the AG at the end of each financial year. Is that not a mandate, a statutory mandate under PFMA?
You're correct. It is a statutory mandate. Requirement for the records to be kept, for the records to be available for audit purposes.
So in this particular instance, especially as it relates to Alexandra Renewal Project, the auditor-general was not given all the financial records as they relate to the project when you wanted to audit them.
That is correct. We were not given the documentation to allow us to conduct the audit and respond to all those questions conclusively.
A failure to do so by an accounting officer or any other delegated official in the department, what implication does that have on the PFMA? Does that not amount to financial misconduct as contemplated on the PFMA?
Through you, Chair, the question is of a legal nature. May I as well from answering that one? I cannot answer that.
Do you have your legal representatives here? Can they can you solicit advice, and then we'll give you a moment to just speak to your legal representative. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will adjourn for 10 minutes. Thank you.
How much money was
Yeah.
And maybe just to close out, with regard to financial matters, that becomes part of our normal regulatory audit, which is a mandatory audit. And that's where the financial aspects of spending from a government perspective are being looked at.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. And I don't intend to quiz you because this is by no means a cross-examination. And I don't also intend to be too legalistic. But looking at the records, which is a high watermark of your submission, to say there was no record with regard to the project, talking about contracts, the procurement processes followed, the expenditure budgets, and whether all of that was aligned to the business plan. Talking about a lot of money, billions, money running to billions. You were not provided with those records. Yes, in terms of PFMA, accounting officers and other officials in the employ of the state are obliged to ensure and keep full proper records of such. And a failure to do so on its own amounts to financial misconduct. But I take your submission to that regard to say this was not a financial audit per se, but a performance audit, as you say. Now, let me rephrase the question now to say, not only are they expected as accounting officers in the departments of the government to keep full and proper records relating to any other financial project that they are doing, but they are also expected, and it's general knowledge, to prepare financial statements for each financial year in accordance with the general practice and recognized accounting practice, and submit to the auditor-general for auditing purposes. Maybe now, with regard to the Alexandra Renewal Project and the financial year at the time, did you receive any from the departments that are involved here in this project? And did you detect any financial irregularity therein?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Chairperson, so we tried earlier on to draw the distinction between the performance audit, which we've come here today to present on, and on the financial side. And on the performance audit, as you correctly mentioned, member, the finances, they were not fully audited, and hence the limitation. We did not get adequate records to test whether the funds were transferred, whether they were indeed spent. On the financial side, we would have subjected it to a regulatory audit. To the extent that we would not, we would have reported as such. Could we bring the information on the financial side to the inquiry? Because it's information that we did not bring with us today. If I understand correctly, you're trying to ascertain whether in the year that we did the audit, what was the audit outcomes in terms of the financial aspect side of the audit and as far as this project was managed, because it is the same environment under which the ARP and the performance audit would have been tested.
Oh, most definitely. That will assist this panel a greatest deal. That we will highly appreciate that part.
Duly noted, and we commit to do so.
Now let me try and limit myself to the performance audit. It's also clear that the performance audit itself did not reflect good on the Alexandra Renewal Project. It was obviously met by lack of production of documents that you needed to enable you to conduct that performance audit. What did you do as AG after discovering that crucial documents that were incidental to this project could not be produced to you? Did you table any report with the recommendations to the SCOPA, to any of the Chapter 9 institutions, for example, the Public Protector, Human Rights, or even the Treasury? Take us to what you did as the auditor-general after obviously establishing this what I can term as impropriety with regard to this audit performance which you conducted in respect of Alexandra Renewal Project.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to our audit process, and I think it's contained in our presentation also, we communicated the shortcomings that we experienced with this audit to those charged with governance in terms of the protocols of the, and I think it's contained on page, let me just take you there now, page 13, where we refer to the stakeholder engagements. So on page 13 you'll see that this report, before tabling, we had communicated with the Premier's office, we had communicated with the chairs of corporate governance, traditional affairs, with the Speaker's office, the MEC's offices, with the mayors and municipal managers of the various municipalities that were part of this process. In that communication, we highlighted all the deficiencies that this report contained. After that engagement, we then tabled the report in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, which contains all the shortcomings, which was then also discussed with and looked at by SCOPA. That's also contained in the presentation and in the document, where the department had given commitments and SCOPA had requested them to give updates on those commitments, which is also contained in the document. Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that clarity. You will bear with us because you shall take cognizance of the fact that as you did the oral presentation of your submission of your report handed to us now, we will not immediately be in a position to consume it everything at the same time. That is why we are asking you questions so that you can give clarity to some of the items on your report. Now I want you to give us a sense of the extent of your role after tabling this report to the relevant authorities like provincial legislature and the SCOPA. Is there some form of mechanism within the AG whereby you monitor the implementation of the recommendations that you shall have made when you made that report available to the provincial legislature and SCOPA? Because you understand where I'm going with that question. I want to see a sense whether at the end of the day was any individual held responsible for any misconduct that may have been identified in the report itself.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, if I again take you to our presentation, and in the presentation, sorry? Yeah. So, our performance audit, we had tabled the report at the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. The Gauteng Provincial Legislature had deliberated on the report, had called in the Department of Human Settlements, and had requested the department to respond to the report. And in that response to the report, they had further made commitments, the department, as to the corrective action that needs to be put in place, and you'll see those commitments also contained in the report. Okay.
If I may. So, Chair, the question, if I may just attempt to respond to the question of whether there's a mechanism. So generally, when we've done a performance audit, I think within a space of 5 to 7 years, there is no specific defined time frame, and it's not mandatory that we get to do a follow-up audit, but it is best practice that we attempt to follow up, to do exactly that, to ascertain whether the findings that we've left them with and the shortcomings therein have been adequately addressed. It would have been at that stage where we would have been privy to whether any attempts of consequence management has been done, or if anyone, as you said, who has been found of impropriety would have been dealt with. Given that the report was tabled in November 2016 and having been shared with legislature as part of our ordinary processes, both in regularity and in performance audit, we audit and then we report to legislature, because those charged with governance have the responsibility to take accountability, investigate as appropriate, and come to to do the right things to make sure that is done. So part of our processes when we conclude both regulatory and financial audits, after having shared the insights with the legislature, we do a follow-up engagement in every audit thereafter. And in part of the audit process, we follow up on commitments made by the respective administration, commitments made by the executive authority, where there's portfolio committees at Parliament and at legislatures, we would also follow those up. And when we engage with them in the subsequent years, we would be there going back to report on the progress that we have seen. So this performance audit was also then the subject of such a machinery. We would have, through the audit process, attempted to follow up whether the shortcomings are being addressed. But because it's not going to be part of the regulatory process per se, the validation and the rigor is not the same. So that is either going to be done if there's a subsequent performance audit, or it will continue to find expression in the regulatory audit, and we'll attempt to close the gap. We've also then noted, as my colleague mentioned on page 15, that SCOPA and through the Gauteng legislature attempted a year later to try and track progress of those commitments. We would have been in attendance at that session to also ascertain that progress, and it is what we have depicted on the table on page 15, with a summary to say the progress, although certain instances of it are being made, it is not significantly addressing the shortcomings as yet. But other aspects like the ring fencing, if there was any, we wouldn't have seen evidence of that, and a lot of the comments that would have supported what we wrote as progress by AGSA would have been through verbal discussion rather than the rigor which would have subjected it to ordinarily through a normal performance audit process. I hope that provides the...
Yes, it did a great deal. And I don't want you to assist the panel understand the nature of your recommendations when you table them to whatever appropriate body in particular circumstances. What is the justiciability or the enforceability of the recommendations of the AG as it stands now? Can somebody or a government official to whom such recommendation is directed or is expected to implement those recommendations, can he just decide to ignore them without any legal implications? What is the status quo there around that issue?
At the time of tabling this report, the recommendations of the auditor-general would have been non-binding, and they would also be implemented at the discretion of the said officials and the accounting officer. It's recommendations, and they had the prerogative to implement it or not to implement it. And then we have, effective from the 1st of April 2019, our PAA has been amended, and there are enhanced powers that come with the office. So as at today, the audit institution can issue if we have found that there's a material irregularity, we can, and it has been through a process where it's first notified to the accounting officer. We've given them a chance to take the requisite steps, because the amendments of our powers are really trying to leverage off the existing legislations, as you refer to the PFMA, the MFMA, are already clear in what the responsibilities of the accounting officers are. So our starting point is to seek to understand whether they've discharged those, and then failure to have done so would first indicate to them if there's a material irregularity, if we have detected during the audit process, give them an opportunity to respond, an opportunity to take action where there is none, and then failure to do so, it could result in a binding remedial action, and then ultimately it could result in a certificate of debt being issued against the respective accounting officer. But that has just been effective from the 1st of April 2019. So for these audit matters at hand, the powers are not retrospective, except if the non-compliance continues to be in existence and the definition of the material irregularity continues to be financial loss, and all those matters continue to prevail. Only then would we be testing this and assessing whether it would be an MI, a material irregularity.
Perhaps just to clarify through you, Chair, the process that my colleague has described in terms of the additional powers now that the AG has, it's with regard to what we call the regulatory audit. It doesn't apply to our performance audit work. So the recommendations that come out of our performance audit work are not enforceable.
No, thanks for that clarity. And in any case, such additional powers will not have applied retrospectively. I'll move on to my next question, which is the last one. Now, with regard to record keeping in the public service in general, there is an observer. We have observed a disturbing trend of poor record keeping, and I'm going to ask you a question, because you are experts in your field, especially of finance. So you are better placed to assist the panel with regard to these things. Now, for example, I want you to help us understand how long are the governmental bodies expected to keep or preserve records, be it of financial nature, or records that are relating to contracts of procurement nature, budgets, and things like that, including the physical care of such records. Can you explain how? Because from where I'm standing, a record that involves a budget, or in actual fact an expenditure of 2.2 billion, it's a record of enduring value that should be kept at all costs. And in this instance, we don't seem to have records relating to this project. Can you assist the panel there with regard to record keeping?
Thank you, Chair. It's a very important question, and I'm going to be specific to the AIFP, the Alexandra Renewal Project. As long as the project is continuing, and at the time when we are auditing, this project is still operational, it's still a project that is engaged on, the records has to be available. Okay, so the fact that the project might be at the point 19 years old or 10 years old is irrelevant. If the project is still in continuation, you have to have all the records from inception of that project, because you have to keep on measuring it against it in terms of the delivery, etc., etc. So you have to have those records as long as that project, and in terms of ARP, the project when we evaluated was still active, so all the records had to be provided. In general, to the other part, how long records that will be kept will be 7 years. That is where projects have been closed. Okay. Yeah, financial records, etc. Thank you.
Let me just come in there on, it's interesting that you are mentioning the 7-year period. Now, are you implying that after 7 years the record can be destroyed, can be disposed of in any manner as the particular official so pleases, without trace? Is that what should be understood with the 7-year period?
There's the National Archives, my apologies, my voice is fading. There's the National Archives Act, which will govern how records are to be kept and disposed of. And then I would imagine critical information would need to be kept and archived appropriately so that it remains available. For audit purposes, for example, because the 7 years is generally in the financial audit space, they can archive it, and if we end up selecting a project that exists there that has since been closed, they need to retrieve that information and still make it available. I think that's why we spoke about how when we address records management, we also talk about recovery, archiving, and records keeping, because if there's ever such inquiries or if there's ever an investigation, it ought to be available. So we trust that those who are managing the project would look at the sensitivity of it and do well to archive everything, especially on a project of this magnitude. As you say, 2.2 billion is a lot of money. Because 7 years is a general time frame, it would not be plausible to not have kept this information.
Of noteworthy is the fact that you are mentioning the National Archive and Record Service Act. Now, upon realizing that you are not being assisted with the necessary record to conduct your audit, did you make any effort to approach the National Archivist to trace these records, to see if they have been archived there?
I should let you, because you conducted the audit. I was going to speak generally.
No. We do not go through that process. The process that we follow is we request the information from those that are accountable for the production of that information. That will be the accounting officers.
If I might add, through performance audit as well as through regulatory audit processes, if we find that information is not available, we escalate to the respective executive authority. We then escalate, as I mentioned earlier on, to the respective legislatures. So this the progress and the status of this audit would have been shared with the highest level of authority, both in the administration as well as oversight, to influence or to get them to compel those who are not cooperating to perhaps do so. It's not our practice to then go outside that process of engagement and then interact with for example, National Archives, especially because the nature of the audits, you would have signed the terms of agreement on how we audit and the escalation protocols, and then escalating to those charged with oversight who are independent from a process is to trigger exactly that action that gets them to get the others to cooperate accordingly.
So exactly what explanation are you given for a failure to have the records? Were you told that the record is lost, is damaged, is destroyed, or archived, or it was just a non-disclosure and no explanation?
So when we asked them for the records, and these were various different stages in the audit process and various different types of records, they could not produce it. So they did not give necessary explanations as to where the records were or why they could not produce it. They said these records were not available for the audit. They could not find it. They could not trace it. As simple as that. There was no mention of it being archived, etc. They said they could not produce the record. They could not trace the record.
Okay, thanks for that. So you did not pursue them either. It's fine. She has just explained that it's not their duty to pursue. Now, the last question, I just want to, this is just an opinion from your side now, because we're talking about a project here which has an expenditure of 2.2 billion. Would you say that all the records relating to this project, given its the amount involved in it, should have been treated as a record of enduring value that should have been archived at the relevant authority, such as the National Archivist?
It could be that they could archive it, depending on what the Archives Act requires of them. But we did allude that from the fact, given the fact that the project was still ongoing, the information should even have been available still with the project management of the JDA or the City of Johannesburg or the department. And whichever one's appropriate ought to have been archived. Because the project hadn't come to its conclusion, one would not have been able to fully evaluate whether the project, without easily retrieving the initial plan documents, on whether at its conclusion or at its progress of implementation, it was achieving its intended objectives. So given the fact that there had not been a formal evaluation or a closeout against the predefined initial targets, we would have thought that it would have made sense to keep these records until such an assessment was done, concluded, and closed off. And then it was a matter of public interest, and it was also a presidential project. And I do mention that, I mentioned earlier that you need planning, you need in-year monitoring and evaluation, and you need reporting. So the project had not gone through that entire life cycle for the records not to have still been available and accessible and retrievable even as at today.
Thank you. How did the non-disclosure of this record impacted on your constitutional mandate as the auditor-general in particular?
It hampered us from reporting the findings conclusively, but in terms of our mandate, when we report such a matter where there is no evidence would be reported as a scope limitation. So we were still able to discharge our responsibilities from auditing, reporting, and concluding, and our conclusion was there was a scope limitation. So we were still able to do that, and then we would have taken it further to the legislatures to make them aware and the requisite executive authority to take the requisite action. So I think we were still able to do our part, escalate, and execute our mandate effectively.
Thank you for your submissions. My nameplate seems to have disappeared, but I'm Matthew Duplessis. I'm from the Gauteng Provincial Office. And let me start off by disagreeing that the new powers granted to the Auditor-General under Section 5, capital A of the Public Audits Act do not apply to discretionary performance audits. I want to try and clear that up so that my line of questioning can make sense, and if I'm wrong, then I have other questions. But last year in October, the Auditor-General spoke at the Banking Summit and complained greatly about lack of enforceability, but also spoke with excitement about the upcoming changes to the Act and the new powers that would be granted under, mainly under Section 5A. Section 5A is about taking remedial action. The Auditor-General must, very important use of the word must here, within a reasonable time, so there's some discretion, but still must, after the issuing of an audit report in terms of Section 20, we'll get back to 20, follow up on whether the accounting officer or accounting authority has implemented the recommendations contained in the report relating to any material irregularity. Subsection 2 of that states that if the accounting officer has failed to implement the recommendations contained in the report, the Auditor-General must take appropriate remedial action to address the failure. It goes on with certain steps of what can be done, but I don't want to tell you what to do. Section 20 of the Act does not delineate between discretionary reports in terms of Section 4, subsection 3, and the other reports in terms of Section 4, subsections 1 and 2. Section 20 merely states that the Auditor-General must, in respect of each audit referred to in Section 11, prepare an audit on the report. Section 11 states that this part applies to all audits which the Auditor-General must perform in terms of Section 4.1 and 2, or opts to perform in terms of 4.3. That latter one is a performance report. I'm assuming, am I correct? Is that the report we're talking about here? Where does the actual delineation come in between this kind of audit performed on the ARP and others?
Thank you. I can refer you to page 3 of our submission, where we're making the distinction between performance audit and regulatory audit, and would like to draw your attention to the fact that performance audit is done under Section 29 of the PAA, whereas regulatory audit, my apologies, are done in terms of Section 20.
Yeah, perhaps maybe to give further clarity, this point we had some legal opinion on it as to what extent does it or doesn't apply with regard to the new powers of the Auditor-General. Perhaps it's fair to say that it doesn't apply to the discretionary audit unless the discretionary audit findings, they can find themselves expression in the regulatory audit, and then they can be followed through that process.
All right, because I'm trying to find an inroad here into Section 4.3, stating that the Auditor-General may audit and report on the accounts, financial statements, and financial management of any public entity listed in the PFA, any institution not mentioned which is funded from national revenue or provisional revenue or by a municipality or authorized in terms of any legislation to receive money for a public purpose. So, is it not possible for the Auditor-General to apply that section and utilize its powers under Section 5A, either with the current audit or to do a new audit in terms of this section, and actually use these enforceable powers that have been given? The powers came into force in April this year, and the long-standing issues in Alexandra came to a head in May during the protests. So haven't recent developments brought to the attention the need that the AG needs to think a little bit out of the box here and apply these new laws in a way that can assist the people of Alexandra?
So Section 4 takes us to the regulatory audits, the financial audits, which will continue on an annual basis. However, the performance audit being discretionary are done under 29. Our new powers, our expanded powers cannot, because of the different section under which this performance audit arose, it cannot be taken into the regulatory audit process. However, if during the regulatory audit process, the Alexandra renewal program continues to be part of the APPs of the respective departments or the City of Johannesburg, and we select those items for auditing, and we find that instances that are not of non-compliance and it meets the criteria, the potential for the powers of the AG that are expanded to be invoked are very possible.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I understand that this the report we had before us was also, it was done before the implementation of the Act. So I'm looking forward, and without the AG having to duplicate too much work perhaps, I think it's very, very important that this happens, especially given recent events and recent changes in the law. But it has been almost 4 months now since these new powers came into effect. I mean, has the Auditor-General looked at this, and with regards to these, not just Alexandra obviously, but others as well, and specifically Alexandra, has the Auditor-General looked and said, all right, we have these new powers, we noted significant shortcomings, lack of documentation, liberties that were taken by accounting officers back in the day when we didn't have the powers we have now. And as the Auditor-General come from that and said, well, let's take another shot at this with our new, significantly more powerful weapon.
The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is from the 1st of April, it's been effective. However, we're on a phased in. So it is not applicable to every single audit environment. And then also equally, we in this July would have only been auditing the PFMA that have been selected for phasing. And then the Alex renewal, as I mentioned, because it's a standalone performance audit, it would not necessarily be subject to the elements of the enhanced powers. However, in the regularity audit, as we continue to apply these powers, and the project continues to exist under whichever organ of state, it could be the subject of audit review. And then the reason I say it's still under audit is because for us to use these powers and have binding remedial action, we must first cross the hurdle that we audit, and it must be in the audit report. So the first audit report that we will be issuing would be the 31st of July. So only once it has been in the audit report that we would have issued could the process then be triggered.
Sorry, 31st of July, so next week. All right.
For the provincial, and then it will be the 30th of November for the municipal government.
Okay. All right. I think that's very important, because there are sections of the Act that were in effect before the amendment and still are. Section 5.3, the Auditor-General may, in the public interest, report on any matter within its function and submit such a report to any other organ of state with a direct interest in the matter. If it wasn't clear before, the Commission clearly has a direct interest in this matter, and in the audit, the summary of the report that you've given to us. Let me quickly find these. The shortcomings that were identified. Funds have not been ring-fenced. As the Commission, we've been out there. We've looked at the effect, and yes, there are more than one contributing factor there, but as a large contributing factor, when we see funds have not been ring-fenced, we see human rights violation. The question is who's responsible for it. The area around Alexandra has not been prioritized in terms of budget allocation and funding. That's mirroring what members of the community have said. People without auditing skills have been able to tell us that. That's not an aspersion on the Auditor-General, it's just a confirmation that these are issues that are deeply, deeply of interest, direct interest to the Human Rights Commission. I'm going to quickly refer to my learned colleague from the Public Protector, who raised specifically as well was it a weak approach? I'm not sure, but the response that was garnered from accounting officers where they failed or refused, for whatever reason, to provide documentation. And the response to terms of reference in your submission states that with regard to whether the alleged 1.3 billion rand budget allocated to the ARP was utilized for the purpose for which it was intended, the audit could not conclude due to the scope limitation as explained in that document. Was that scope limitation not just caused by failure, recalcitrance of the accounting officers in question to cooperate and provide you with the documents? Would that be correct?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chair. Again, that scope limitation refers to the documentation that could not be provided. Okay, so without a full picture of all the documents, we cannot conclude on that piece of work that we actually audited.
Let's say that happens again going forward, and the audit is once again limited in its scope. Is that not in and of itself an audit finding? The fact that the documentation could not be provided and thus the audit was limited in its scope, is that not in itself an even more severe audit finding, one that would definitely call into necessity the new powers that, assuming all of the hurdles can be overcome, and I understand those have been raised, would that not call into severe necessity the use of those powers against these accounting officers?
It can. It could certainly cause that.
Yeah, no, as Mabacho has indicated, you definitely can. There's criteria that we evaluated against. Each finding is evaluated against criteria. There's a MI process that we go through. So to just take an item and say, okay, it definitely would not be correct, because we have to go through a process, and that process is subject to various criteria that we subject the finding to, depending on what's the significance of it, the materiality, etc. Okay.
So, going forward then, my hope is that the Auditor-General will submit, and I understand this is a report of sorts, but I wouldn't call this a report in terms of Section 5.3. One done in the Auditor-General's discretion. It was on our request, so I think we would appreciate a further report, particularly following the release of further audits next week, the 31st of July. Would that be possible? Would the Auditor-General be able to convene further with the Human Rights Commission following next week's release?
Thank you very much. We would be committed and able and willing to convene and ascertain which of the information we can provide. A small caveat, though, on the 31st of July, I think I did mention that the audits must first be tabled in legislature to become public documents before they're available for us to share. And then also there's the general reports which we do prepare every year, which give an overall assessment of the financial audits, which are also quite useful, which we will bring for purpose of that engagement as well.
Thank you. And I'll just end with a reminder about the definition of material irregularity. It means any non-compliance with or contravention of legislation, breach of a fiduciary duty, a number of other things, but that's enough for now, that resulted in or is likely to result in a list of things, but very importantly, harm to the general public. Please keep in mind in the audit that that's what we're looking for as the Commission. I know the Public Protector is looking at issues of maladministration, and those are also relevant to our investigation, but the most important aspect to address before the Commission has at all times during this investigation, and I think particularly with regard to this, been on harm suffered by the public, harm in the form of violations of the right of a number of basic human rights. So where that harm arises as a result of, or is likely to arise as a result of non-compliance, that is the form of material irregularity that we need full compliance with, a cooperation with the AG on, and we would appreciate that. But thank you, those are my questions. I understand what I need to now.
Thank you, colleagues. From your assessment of the project in Alexandra, would you say that the project was doomed from start?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, as we've indicated in our briefing document and the report, there were very good practices that we observed when the project had started. And to a large extent, had those practices been continued and encouraged, then the project could have been successful. So I would not say that the project was doomed from the start, because there was very good practices that we could see that was in place, and the intention was good, but it fell off as it continued.
If I may add, Chair, we unfortunately also only conducting the audit after the request came in July 2014, and the project having commenced and been initiated in 2001. I think given the lapse of time, we were at a disadvantage in terms of whether when it initially started, did it live to the aspirations that they had envisaged. So we were significantly hampered from making that conclusion.
So you can't pronounce on whether or not there was a business case or the business case was poor?
I think, yeah, as we have stated in the report, it was not our mandate to look at the business plan as to what extent does it satisfy community needs. But once the business plan is in play, we were auditing whether are we delivering against that business plan. But the development of a business plan is a management issue that they need to make sure that it addresses the needs of the communities.
To further compound the problem is that the initial business plan when the project was initiated was not made available for us to be able to see how the project had been conceptualized. What we got hold of is the amended business plans from the different project managers and different officers that had then subsequently taken responsibility for attempting to roll out the project. And we did note that those were then being changed to respond to whatever imperatives at that stage that they were prioritizing and attempting to resolve.
So unlike, because I want to ascertain, are you allowed to broaden the scope of your work, or you're only limited to what the client wants you to audit? Because with the Human Rights Commission, with the Public Protector, we can broaden the scope. We can start investigating something, and then in the middle of it say, okay, we'll also look into the following.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, okay, maybe, sorry? Okay. Maybe just to be clear, ours was not an investigation. When we do standalone investigation, it's a separate process.
An audit, are you allowed to broaden the scope of your audit?
Okay, so you're allowed to broaden a scope of an audit, okay, but it's where you broaden the scope, it will be by either the agreement on the initial scope to broaden it. So you cannot just broaden the scope on its own, because remember, up front your engagement is for a specific area of what you are looking at. So if you have broadening of the scope for a performance audit, then you will have to have agreements on that scope, because remember, it's a discretionary audit. Okay, so you'll have to go and get agreements from the various stakeholders that, okay, we're going to include these different areas that we look at. And remember, the performance audit is looking at the effectiveness, efficiency, and economical usage. So it's not, as Sifa has indicated, going where you have an investigation and then you deem it, okay, there is something that I need to re-look at here, or it goes further that you said. So this is not an investigation. It's basically looking at those questions that we had set up front. Sorry, Mabato.
If I may add, I think you will see that there's evidence of an attempt on our side to broaden the scope. The initial question we're going to try and focus on when was to get the initial business plan. In the absence of that, we then don't walk away. We look at alternative procedures that could still allow us to have answers to the research questions. And that is why we were able to obtain the revised business plans and use that and try and audit. But then therein comes the limitation in that we were only able to look at the revised business plan and whether those were implemented according to the project objectives, but did not have the initial one. So we do, even in the section of the housing, you'll find that we'll want an initial project list. We may not have, but then we'll get what other alternative source of documentation that they can give us, and we try to still sample and attempt to answer the questions. It's only where there is no alternative procedures that can be performed that we really have to walk away, as in the case of the SCA.
Sorry, Chair, perhaps maybe if I can just get better clarity from your question when you say broaden the scope, because maybe we might have not understood you.
You've covered that question. Yeah. Is there perhaps a reason why you could not locate or get access to this initial business plan?
Once again, Chair, our process is to request the business plan from the accounting officer, and there's specific reasons why you request it from the accounting officer, because he's the accountable person. Okay, so you request the documents to the accounting officer, and it's about accountability. So the accounting officer has to represent that document to us as part of the audit process. So again, once again, in answering this here, the accounting officer could not produce the document to us. When that happened, as I'm about to explain, when that happened, because part of the performance audit is try to add value in terms of the recommendations, etc., to improve this process, to find the gaps and try to improve the process. So when this did not happen, we always try to look at other means to say we're still trying to add value. Hence you'll see our recommendations, etc. We look for other documents that can support us and help us to still do work to find gaps that we can add value.
Yeah, I like the explanation about what a performance audit entails, because some of the people linked to this project have used this performance audit report to saying there was no malfeasance, there was no impropriety, there was no corruption. Would that be a misrepresentation of your audit?
Through you, Chair, I think our audit findings are clear. It is for the purposes of this commission as you understand them. But I don't think that we can comment on how other people interpret our reports. I don't think it's a fair comment.
Aren't you worried as a Chapter 9 body that people will begin to now cast aspersions on the basis of what politicians and accounting officers say, using this report to say there's no wrongdoing? MEC Maile convened a press conference in Annex and boldly pronounced that there was no wrongdoing. And one of the reasons why we felt that we needed to invite you was to also set the record straight, because in the process it could cause reputational harm to this eminent body in our country. Yeah.
That is correct. Thank you, Chair. Given that the scope of this performance audit did not include us looking at corruption and all these elements, and neither was it an investigation, I think it would be fair to say a conclusion that we did not conclude there was corruption is not fully accurate, seeing as what we have concluded on is the 5 elements that we have said we have audited. And regrettably, because of the scope limitation, we were also equally not to conclude on those. And I think our report is clear that in the areas of the ALEX renewal program, against the researchable questions, we had findings across the different areas: planning, implementation, access to basic infrastructure, and supply chain. And that is where we're confined. Supply chain is where there may be instances of non-compliance, where there may be instances of fraud. I draw attention to the fact that that area was equally subject to a scope limitation. So as our office, I think our report is clear. It is a scope limitation. We have not been in any way been able to conclude on whether the EEE was achieved for this project because of the scope limitation. Any other conclusions drawn herein are perhaps not technically accurate.
And sorry, and through you, Chair, I think we appreciate this opportunity because it allows us the opportunity to clarify or give clarity in terms of the context of the report.
No, thank you. So as you embarked on this exercise, I assume you looked at the project management methodologies to guide you. Is that correct?
Yes, we do look at how the project was managed as one of the criteria.
And some of the basic processes used in project management are the following. You look at initiation, planning and design, execution, monitoring and control, and you look at the closure of the project. But we know it's ongoing. But where would you say you uncovered serious challenges or problems with the renewal program? Was it at the planning and design? Was it at the execution phase? Or was it at the monitoring and control stage?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. So once again, from the information that was provided, remember we've got a scope limitation. So it means, and let me go into some details so you get a bit better understanding. It means we requested a project file. That project file could not be provided to us. So my team could not, all those good practices that you were talking about, my team could not evaluate it against that because we didn't have the documents to evaluate it against. So for the limited documents that we did have, again going back to the concept where I said the performance audit wants to try as far as possible to add value to the processes. For the documents that we could source, we then had a lot of challenges also, and that is also contained in the document and in the briefing where we say there was poor project planning, there was poor project management, etc. There were poor systems in place. There wasn't proper controls in place to manage the documentation that they had. So when, for example, if a person was moved from a function or the person resigned, remember we're looking at the lifespan of this project for a very long time, whether they moved or resigned or moved to another job, there was no proper handover processes. So as a result, documentation goes missing. There wasn't common systems that was in place to manage these projects. So these are the things that were those challenges for all phases here.
So the short answer to your question is that we noted limitations across all the phases of the project with the limited information that we were able to look at. For example, you mentioned about monitoring. There were instances where we looked at the reports. There were progress reports that were submitted. Those progress reports do not necessarily have all the basics in place for the project managers to be able, without going on site, to ascertain the progress, the limitations, and everything. So even that bit of information that we were able to secure further corroborated the fact that there were challenges across the value chain of project management. And I think as we've indicated across all the 4 renewal programs, one of the cross-cutting measures in its entirety was poor project management.
You've given us clues that this project is or was headed for trouble. And the question is, did you inquire as to why are they still continuing this project, given all these challenges that you have flagged?
That sits in, so with the audit process, it's never for us to comment on policy issues.
Yeah.
So this one was earmarked at a presidential level, having, I imagine, done the necessary research to ascertain whether this project should have been set up and responding to big imperatives for the Alex community. When we found limitations in the project, ours was to share what those gaps are and trust that our advice will be heeded on how to improve the shortcomings, given that there was an intention to continue with this project indefinitely. The merits of the project, I think, are still relevant. You look at what is happening in Alexandra, so they remain critical. What remains important is for the project to be implemented, upholding all the best practices of sound project management. So we would leave that decision to management. But we hope that our advice would assist in knowing the areas that need to be tightened and monitored on, and where they need to exercise oversight, so that as they continue to spend even one more rand, it is spent against the system where it is credible. They can monitor, report, and be able to ascertain that money was spent for the right purposes.
And maybe through you, Chair, just to emphasize the purpose of our performance audit, it's not to make decisions on whether to stop a project or not. That's a management decision. We should just give them enough.
But you can recommend, right?
No, we don't.
You don't even recommend.
No. Highlight weaknesses.
So even if you can see that there are going to be cost overruns, they're not going to meet their time frames, and by the way, you're talking about public money, so you'd still say, okay, continue. We'll have another. Okay, I almost mentioned another project, but yeah.
Once again, I don't think. Okay, the nature of performance audit is not to make management decisions. Those are decisions that have to be made with those that are charged with governance, to their legislators. For us is to bring issues that they need to correct in the process to make sure that it gets successful.
If I can add, I think exactly to what Sipho was just saying, I think we assist along the value chain to allow those charged with oversight, exercising that oversight over how this project is managed through the executive authority or administration, to look at our findings and make an informed decision, or to hold management accountable that if the project is going to continue, it's going to be under different foundational framework.
In your assessment, if you agree with people who argue that this project was not a success, the Alexandra Renewal Project, and they say this, looking at the delivery of the project on time, on budget, with the required features and functions. So, what is your assessment as the Office of the Auditor-General of this project? Would you say this ARP was a success or not?
The success of the project was significantly compromised. And again, remember, the nature of performance audit, simplistically, is where we assess whether government is doing the right thing, and in doing that which it is attempting to do, are they doing it in the right and least expensive way? And technically we call it economy, efficiency and effectiveness. So had we been given the appropriate documentation that would have allowed us to audit across those three elements, we would have been able to arrive at a conclusion that said, did they do the right thing in putting out this project, and did they do it in the right and least expensive manner? Given the limitation, we are unable to conclusively say so.
Yeah, this exercise was, and obviously because of the scope limitation, you couldn't also look at conflict of interest issues, because we were told that some of the project managers, they had companies that were, these companies were doing business with government. You have persons who are politically exposed, who have benefited according to the allegations and submissions through this project. So, given all these challenges that you have noted and raised with the powers that be, would you say that this project warrants or merits a forensic audit, so that you are able to follow the money, you are able to ascertain if the prices are inflated, the conflicts of interest, people improperly benefited, and so forth? What would be your recommendation to this inquiry panel?
Given the scope limitation and no evident process that we noted, even given the follow-up in 2017, there has still been no information that was availed to say, Auditor-General, during your audit, you noted a scope limitation. Here is further information that you could use. I'm not sure how successful the forensic investigation could be. However, as I mentioned, having reported to those charged with governance, as well as the executive authority, they need to ascertain the most appropriate manner to understand what has transpired and to consider the right course of action and to take the appropriate remedial action to be able to account for these funds that were spent.
I'm also interested in your engagements with the Premier of the province, David Makur. It's on page, on page 13 of your presentation, you received a series of commitments from key stakeholders. From the number one citizen in the province, what was the commitment after this exercise? Before this report was tabled at the Gauteng legislature.
When you do the engagements with those charged with governance, is to share these findings with them. The commitments comes from the accounting officer of the department. So we do not solicit independent.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. My apologies. We would source those commitments and be able to give you feedback on when we share this with the number one leader of Gauteng, what his sentiments are. Every time we engage them, we do make note of the commitments. Unfortunately, we have just summarized it.
But you can share that with us.
We will be able to get it. But one thing they did across the entire leadership, they welcomed the insights and they appreciated, because you would recall it was initiated by the Gauteng MEC of Cooperative Governance and Human Settlements with the support of the Premier to initiate this project. And they signed off on it because it is a discretionary one. And when we shared the insights and the shortcomings therein, they welcomed it and they made the commitments. So the commitments that we summarized here would be a collective reflection of what the executive authority are jointly committing that they want to do to redress what was the errors were noted and the shortcomings in the project.
The ARP was at some point, or we are informed it's now, the city of Johannesburg is also doing its own ARP. Have you received any requests from the mayor of the city of Johannesburg to conduct a similar performance audit of ARP?
Not at the stage. We have not received such a request. And then if the city of Johannesburg is doing the ARP, it would be subject to the normal regulatory audit process. And I've committed that we are happy to collaborate with the Commission on audits that have already been finalized to to ascertain to what extent the City of Johannesburg has continued to render or the program of the ARP, and we'll be happy to make that information available.
Usually, how long would it take to conduct a performance audit of a project of this magnitude?
Chair, okay, of this magnitude, on the scope that we had, will probably be taking a year, okay? And then obviously it's provided that all the sufficient information, etc., is available. Because remember, we don't have information, and it becomes much more difficult to, because then you have to start looking for information, going to other sources, etc. So if everything is provided as requested within the time frames, it normally take a year with the scope that we had.
Okay, your parting shot. Is there anything that you'd like to add or recommend? As you know, our investigations are ongoing. We hope to conclude this process by the end of October. So if you have any information, please share that information with us. But is there anything that you would like to say before we conclude?
I would like to thank the inquiry for the opportunity to come here and collaborate as fellow Chapter 9 institution. And I did say we continue to remain available to collaborate and support in assisting you to complete your responsibilities so that the work we do collectively of upholding our Constitution is effective.
Sorry, and we further take a note of whatever the additional information that we'll make available to you.
Okay, can we have that by the 15th at least? We've asked others who have appeared before us this week to make that additional information available on or before the 15th of August, if possible. We can always grant extensions, but ideally the 15th. Yep.
Can I confirm City of Johannesburg, Financial Information, Department of Human Settlements, and that is the regulatory audit process. Thank you. And the commitments, my apologies, that the Premier would made. And if there's any other information that you would need, Chair, through you, we would be happy to receive in writing a record all of that so that we provide everything speedily. If there's anything else that you think about that we may not, we'll also look and make sure we give you a complete set of insights.
Thank you again for cooperating with the Commission. Thank you for your submissions and for clarifying a lot of these issues. And this is the end of the public process. The investigations are ongoing, and we'll continue to engage with individuals whose names have been mentioned during this process, who through documents and allegations are implicated, because we have a duty to act fairly and to afford them a right of reply. Thank you again. That concludes the fourth and final sitting of the Alexandra Inquiry. Thank you to colleagues and everyone. Yeah.
Short. Include up there.